Hello, everyone, and welcome to the International Interprofessional Mentorship Program. My name is Kate Barlow, and I am the founder and host of today's meeting. It's December 8th, 2022, and today Lori Blaire is here to talk about risk management. Please mute yourselves through the presentation and hold any questions until the end. You can type your questions into the chat box as they come up, and then I can also ask them for you at the end. In order to receive a certificate of attendance, you will need to complete the survey link that I will put in the chat box momentarily. At the conclusion of the presentation, we will also have a meet and greet, and we would love for you to stay and introduce yourself. All right, well, let's get started. Thank you so much, Lori, for coming.
Oh, and I am so excited to be here. As Kate said, I'm Lori. I'm an OT. I've been an OT for going on 45 years. So when the OT dinosaurs roamed the earth, I got started in OT. And I am actually a CHC, which is a Certified Healthcare Compliance Officer, and a CPCO, which is a Certified Professional Compliance Officer. What does that mean? It means that all day long, I work as a risk manager. Presently, I am the Compliance Officer for Enhanced Therapies. Enhanced Therapies is a wonderful parent company of 9 rehab companies throughout the United States. So let's get started. What are the goals for today's in-service? Well, obviously, to really understand risk management and help keep our patients, our visitors, and our employees safe while they're in PT and OT and speech. I'm going to primarily be talking about OT, but a lot of this transfers into other disciplines as well. I wanted to be able to provide information on the risk, the hazards, controls, and mitigation solutions so that you have a safe space and design for your OT treatment areas and your staff areas. I wanted to also be able to give you guys a list of hazards and risk for you to use a checklist in your departments. And when you have a nice checklist of what the risks are, you could have and develop more efficient and effective systems and processes to either minimize the risk or hopefully eliminate the risk altogether. And I wanted to be able to provide the OTs on this call a resource to assist them in worksite analysis. Best place to start always is with a definition of risk management. So what is a risk? A risk is what might happen, what could happen, what is a potential issue. But what is the hazard? The hazard is actually the activity, the arrangement, the circumstance, the process that could be a potential source of harm. So if you think about a falls risk, a person could be a falls risk. But what is the hazard? It could be their lower extremity weakness, their trunk control. It could be their poor or ill-fitting footwear. So we really do in risk management look at the risk and the hazards. What is the definition of risk management? It's a process, and it's a process of identifying, assessing, controlling what might happen, what could happen, as well as decreasing the amount of threats and vulnerabilities in having these unwanted events. So risk management is also the application of methods and processes in which we help to try to prevent, to manage, or to mitigate the risk. When we talk about risk management in healthcare, we're basically talking about a complex set of administrative and clinical controls and processes and reports that help us detect, monitor, and mitigate any kind of risk that we might see in a healthcare environment. So why do we do risk management? Well, if you understand the risk and you prevent an unwanted event, it actually improves the patient's safety and prevents injuries. That is really why we look at risk management in a healthcare. We want to keep our patients and our staff safe. It also helps you to prevent reputational harm. If you're an OT department that has a lot of incidents and accidents and has a lot of risk, there goes your reputation for high quality of care. Also, if you work in a government hospital or you are in a country that's regulated, your healthcare is regulated by the government, then you have a lot of risk, you have a lot of incidents and accidents. You may get a lot of investigations and be accused of wrongdoing. If you have good risk management, it helps us plan for disasters and emergency situations. Let's look at worldwide COVID. Well, the last time we had a pandemic was the Spanish flu in 1918. So since 1918, did we as worldwide organizations plan for a disaster or a pandemic? Not really. When you do risk management, and I know that from lessons learned, there's a lot more World Health Organizations now doing risk management and looking at disaster and emergency management plans as part of their risk management program to prevent another pandemic. When you do risk management, it also helps you adhere to regulations. We have this problem, it's a potential risk. What's the laws against it? And it helps us learn our best practice techniques. What do we do as OTs to make sure that if we have a risk, that we are using the best techniques to prevent against injury or any kind of unwanted event? One of the biggest risks across the world now is cybersecurity. We know that a lot of countries are using electronic medical records. In a click of a computer, hundreds of thousands and millions of patient records could be compromised. Why do we do risk management? Well, we do it for cybersecurity to help decrease a loss of confidentiality of our patient records. Now, if you're in a country where you're still using paper records, well, you know what? Paper records have a huge risk for loss of confidential information. I cannot tell you how, through the years before we had EMRs and electronic medical records, how many times I would walk through a gym and see all the therapists leave all the patient records open on their desk. So please understand that, we do risk management to protect our patient records. It also helps us reduce the likelihood of unwanted events and the severity of the event if it happens. Let's look at COVID. Let's say we're going to say that a control that we use for COVID is vaccination. Well, it's certainly, when we did risk management and we looked at what kind of control we should use, helps us reduce the likelihood of a COVID illness. And even if you get the COVID illness, now that you're vaccinated, would you be able to have a less severe case, which would not necessitate hospitalization? The bottom line is when you do risk management, it makes your job safer. If you make it safer for the patient, make it safer for you, it helps you save time and effort because you don't have to deal with those unwanted events. Unwanted events, occurrences, incidents, and accidents sometimes have a financial burden. We say that if you have good risk management, it could create a financial benefit for you. So the next step is the how-to. So how do we do risk management? What are those steps? Well, first, you have to do risk identification. And the way I like to look at risk identification is by saying, let me put it in a category. So is it a risk to our care and our patients? Is it a risk to the quality? Is it a risk to operations? Is it a risk to our reputation? Is it a risk to compliance with laws and regulations and policies and procedures? Is it a financial or economic risk? Is it an environmental risk, like an infection? So once you first identify the risk, then you have to analyze it. You have to say, how bad of a risk is it? What is the severity of that risk? And how bad would it impact our patients, our staff, our organization in general? And once you know that, you say to yourself, well, how fast would it hurt us? So if you have a severe risk, that is going to hit you very quickly and your impact is going to be very large, you're going to say to yourself, oh, I better do something quickly about that risk. And that leads you to the third step, which is risk prioritization. You usually will make a list of all the risks that you have, from the most damaging to the least damaging, because you know you're going to tackle the most damaging first, because it's going to hit you the hardest, it's going to have the greatest impact, and it's going to hit you at a speed that you don't want. So after you prioritize it, then you're going to say, okay, we have to mitigate it. We have to reduce or eliminate it. So how do we do that? Well, first you have to accept that it's a risk. Some people like to ignore, no, it's not a risk. You've got to accept the risk. And then could we avoid it altogether? And if you could avoid the risk, then you're lucky. We don't really have to mitigate it. And some industries can transfer the risk. What does that mean? You put the risk basically on somebody else. If we were in banking, we would pretty much have the risk transferred to our insurance companies. But we're not a bank. We're healthcare. We're OTs. So most of the risk falls solely on our shoulder in terms of patient care. And then what you do is, after you've identified the risk, you've analyzed the risk, you've prioritized the risk, you've mitigated the risk. Well, then you monitor and you audit. Are your systems and ops to reduce or mitigate working? So what you realize is this is a never-ending process. You just can't say, okay, I did my job, no more risk. You're constantly monitoring your risk management to make sure that all the things you put into place are working well and are continuing to mitigate or reduce the risk. Risk change depending on your caseload, depending on your staffing, depending on your equipment. So your risk management job is never over. You continually have to do this process. So when you're talking about risk, you also have to look at hazard assessment. I love hazard assessment. I love to look at the hazards that we have, why we have those hazards, and how do we get rid of them. So when we're looking at the hazards, we're looking at what are the hazards to our patients, what are the hazards to our staff, what are the hazards to our visitors, and also I like to put in there our community, because sometimes the hazards that we see at our hospitals, in our outpatient facilities, spill over to our communities. So you rate the hazard. Is it mild? Can it result in a minor injury? Is it moderate? Is that injury that it's going to result in going to require intervention? Is it going to require hospitalization? Or is it serious, where it can result in a loss of life, limb, or consciousness? You have to look at what is that severity of the hazard, and then what's the likeliness that it's going to hit you? Is it unlikely? The harm would seldom occur. Is it likely? Was it unlikely? Is it likely where it's going to happen more often than not? And then is it very likely? Like, there's no way around it. We are near certain to have this occur. So really, when you're looking at risk, you're looking at severity times a likelihood with these hazards. So you sit back and you say to yourself, what could happen here in our OT department? How likely is that to happen? What could be done to decrease the likelihood? And what kind of physical, managerial, clinical kind of controls can we put into place? And what's the potential damage, if it does happen, to our organization, to our patients, to me as the OT? So those are some of the things that you're asking yourself while you're doing your risk assessment and risk management processes. So I thought it would be a good idea to kind of give you lots of risk, that this could be used as your checklist. And I have to admit, as I was sticking them in, I was thinking to myself, I probably should go over this with my team because I'm not sure until I really kind of set up this in-service for today that I actually had a good enough list of risk. And I'm sure that you guys and my team are going to be able to add more and more risk. And this is a really nice way of starting a checklist. So first, when you go into the OT department, are there physical environmental hazards? Are you working in an unclean, cluttered, unkept patient and staff working areas? What about unsafe flooring? You know, in the United States, a lot of these new gyms are hiring fancy designers to design these gyms. And they are picking the most outrageous flooring, like black and white checks or herringbone. And we're having more and more and more falls because of this crazy new flooring. Instead of just keeping it simple, some of these new designers are looking at more chic flooring, which is a hazard to our patients. How about lifted carpeting? Even in patients' homes, they may have lifted carpets or carpets in ill repair, or they may have these crazy high thresholds that we might have to remove. But you know, when you're looking at your physical environment, it's not just your clinic area. It's what's going on in the bathrooms or the washrooms, the hallways, the steps, you know, all the areas where you guys are treating. What about the temperature? You know, in the United States, where I live in the East Coast, we have varied temperatures. Is it too hot or too cold? And I work in geriatrics, so everybody's always cold. So we really have to monitor the temperature in our environments because that alone could be a risk. What about adequate ventilation? Is the room stuffy? Is it musty? Is it going to give your patients with respiratory illnesses? Are they going to feel worse when they come to OT? Is there a lack of warning signs? I recently went to an outpatient physical therapy for a back problem, and it's owned by a friend of mine. And I walked in there and they had the hydrocolate hot pack in the middle of the room with no sign that said caution hot. And of course, my friend looked at me and goes, I hate when you come here, Lori, because you're like scanning to make sure that we're compliant. And before I left, I hung a sign on that machine. I moved it and I hung a sign to say caution so nobody would touch it. What about mechanical risks? Are you working with unsafe equipment or machinery, poor safety devices? Is your machinery that you're using or your gym equipment in ill repair and poor condition, older than I am? You know, what about equipment calibration? A lot of places don't do this. You have a hot pack machine, and the hot pack machine is supposed to be kept at probably 140 to 160 degrees. Sometimes the hot pack is older and it's at 180 degrees or it's at 110 degrees. It might not be effective or it may burn the patient. Does somebody in your hospital maintenance department look at your equipment every year to make sure that it is manufacturally sound? Or do you maybe need to retire that piece of equipment because it's not working well? There's a lot of moving parts on your bikes, on your treadmills that wear out. Do we need to get those repaired? Biological hazards. If this pandemic has taught us anything, it's about wiping down our equipment. Do people wipe down the equipment? Do you have the right disinfectants and sanitizing agents to wipe down that equipment? Are you in a place where you have patients that may bleed, like a whirlpool room? You know, what is your exposure to blood and body fluids, and how do you deal with that? Do you have enough personal protective equipment? Many of us in the beginning of the pandemic did not have masks and gowns and goggles and booties and you know, hair coverings. And now it's more plentiful, like from a manufacturing point of view, but a lot of facilities do not have enough PPE. And sometimes it's only in one area, maybe in the gym, but there's no PPE in the washrooms and the bathrooms. So we really have to look at, is that a risk? What about limited infection control policies? infection control is really in the forefront across the world. Like, how do we ensure that we're controlling, infections, viruses, those kinds of things? How do you dispose of your waste that may be contaminated? And again, I'm giving you all the risk, and hopefully at the end, we'll tie it together with some controls. But are you disposing even a Band-Aid in a way that is not respective of infection control policies? Do you have a lot of injuries and accidents? Do you have clinical risk? Do you have limited knowledge, limited training? Do you have a bunch of new OT staff that may not have the mentorship to understand techniques and interventions and do them safely? Or do you lack the supervision? Are you in a place that you're the only OT and you may not have the supervision that you need? And that is why this program is amazing, because thank you, Kate, letting everybody know that you have avenues in which to get more training materials. How about your manual lifting hazards? Are you in a place where maybe you can't do a 2-man lift and there's only one of you and you may have a bariatric patient? Maybe you don't have, you're doing all manual lifts and there's nobody to help you with mechanical lifts. Do you understand biomechanics? Who's watching the shop? Who's watching the shop to make sure that in the OT department, that there is good quality OT treatment, good quality documentation of the patient's needs? But maybe you work in an area where you have a lot of difficult patients and maybe abusive patients and maybe dangerous patients. What other risks do we have? Chemical exposure to chemicals. Most often the OTs are only exposed to cleaning materials. But there are some OTs who work in places that are right next to the maintenance department or share a space, and there may be chemicals that are dangerous. This is a scary story, but it doesn't happen anymore. I remember in the 80s, I worked in a very nice hospital, a prestigious hospital, and we did a lot of whirlpools. And there was a run of young ladies who were having miscarriages. And they found out that some of the hydrotherapy and whirlpool chemicals that we were using back then were toxic to pregnant women. Obviously, they don't use those chemicals anymore, but you don't know, and you should know what chemicals you're exposed to. Psychological risk. Are you working long shifts? Oops, sorry, I jumped ahead. Working long shifts with unreasonable caseloads and crazy patient demands? Are you feeling, oh my gosh, this is making me nervous, I don't have enough training? You work with abusive patients. Are you fatigued and stressed? Electricity. Are you working in a facility that has good power sources and sockets and power cords? Recently, one of my staff members was working in an older building. She went to go plug in her laptop and got a shock because the power socket probably was not evaluated since maybe 1901. What about fire risk? Are you working in a place where there are flammable items or materials near the OT department? Do you have a lack of fire safety equipment or training? Do you guys participate in fire safety and fire drills? And then what about ergonomic? How is the planning of your workstation? Are you on your feet for a long time per day? Do you get to sit someplace? Are things higher or lower? There are OTs that actually specialize in ergonomic design. I'm not one of them, but it's an interesting way to look at your risk based on the ergonomic design of your clinic. And then we have the host of quality risk, which is failing to meet the patient's needs. Are we offering poor quality? And poor quality is due to 3 things. It's due to poor staffing, poor training, and poor leadership. So we can control those things. And are you not meeting the patient's expectation? Sometimes the control for something like that is, did you ask the patients what they expect? If you're working in a system where the government is not paying for a lot of your healthcare needs and people are paying privately, have you asked them what their expectations are? And are you meeting those? And then you can have an economic or financial risk. Do you have poor funding for staffing, for equipment? and for safety needs is their low cash flow. One of the things that is different in the United States than other places is everything relates to healthcare dollars. Financial risk in the United States is probably one of the biggest things that OTs face, because everything we do has to be documented to get paid. So this, in some countries, is not a risk, and into other countries is a huge risk. And then reputational. Are you working with people who just are acting inappropriately, which I would hope from an OT perspective, we never see this. I put operations risk in big red because sometimes if you have an operational system that is horrible, it's going to cause all the other risk. Like, for instance, if you have poor staffing, then you'll have poor quality. Or because not everybody's needs will be met, you may have reputational. You might, if you're lacking the equipment, you can't possibly have a good repertoire of activities to use for the patients, even as creative as you want to be, because I've worked in some places where me as an OT was the only OT in a broom closet, and that's not a lie. I was given a broom closet with one piece of TheraBand, and that was it. And thankfully, I had family that were into woodworking, and they helped me build equipment that nobody would give me. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I think that a lack of good leadership is going to be one of your biggest operational risks. If the person who's leading the show does not have good systems, operations, understand risk management, all else will fail. You will have a lot of strategic mismanagement and day-to-day failures in the OT department, and you may not be able to control that, which is going to be incredibly frustrating. So now, what do you have to do? What do you have to do to, what do you have to consider when you're looking at how do I get rid of these risks? Well, you're going to look at your present challenges. Do you have a lot of infections in your hospital, in your outpatient department? I mean, for where I work right now, COVID, we have a lot of units, and I work in nursing homes, which I know in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, is not common. But we have a lot of residents that are, have COVID or the flu or RSV, and we're not able to bring them down to a gym and treat them. So we're doing a lot of bedside treatments. So our risks are different. So we've had to look at, during the pandemic, the difference in the risk in the gym versus the risk in the patient's rooms, because our challenges have changed. You also have to look at, I want to get rid of this risk. What are the policies and procedures of my organization where I work, as well as what are the laws, federal or governmental laws. I also have to look at best practice techniques. What's the best way to get rid of this or reduce or eliminate this particular risk? And do I have the people who are credentialed or experienced enough to help me do that? What are the patient's rights? Do we have a patient who's paying privately, who has special rights because he's paying privately? Or are we giving the same rights to the patients who are in governmental hospitals? What about medications? Does certain medications present a risk for us, like saying falls? Or maybe there's a lack thereof of medications. Can the patient not afford the medication, which is going to give us different risk? Who's the risk to? Is it to our patients only? Is it to our visitors? Is it to the staff? Is it to the community? And then we always have to consider, how much is this going to cost us to get rid of this risk? We always want to eliminate the risk if we can, but if we cannot eliminate it, we want to reduce it. The first thing I always do, as I said, when I went into my friend's outpatient center, is I scan the physical environment. It's almost like I feel like I have that, sixth sense to pick up what's a danger from doing this. So physical inspection gives you a lot of information on what the risks are. It also may give you a lot of information on how to mitigate that risk. And also, if you have an accident investigation is instrumental to risk identification and mitigation. because we do what we call a root cause analysis. What caused that accident? Then we prevent it the next time. So accident investigation is amazing. It's very helpful. So you want to pay attention to the spaces you work in, including technology and equipment. And you want to know, and studies have shown that the more physical safety that you give a patient is the better they will perform. Other challenges we face, COVID pandemic, other infections, monkeypox, Ebola, we have RSV all over the United States. Those are all the things that we have to consider when we're doing risk identification and mitigation. Violence. There's been an uptick of violence between patients and communities. Is staff burnt out? They say that people have COVID fatigue, but it's not just COVID fatigue. Do you have stress? Are you prepared in an emergency? Do we have emergency management plans? I know I do, because I stayed up at night writing these things. And the biggest challenge we have to mitigation is nobody did the risk assessment. So what do you have to consider now? You understand about what risk management is, what the kind of risks that you face, really some of the challenges you face with mitigation. So now say you're going to design your treatment space. Now I realize spaces are different no matter where you go. I've been in a broom closet all the way to a 25,000 square foot gym. But even if you don't get your wish list for the space, there's still stuff you should think about. You want to always ensure that you have uncluttered space, right? So, and you can accommodate more than one patient if possible. And that you have clearly marked areas or signage to help people navigate your department, like bathroom, splint room. You want to have safety equipment, obviously, where you need it in the department and in the washrooms. You want to make sure that you have proper ventilation, as I said. That helps with the decrease of infections. If you're on a ground floor, you could open windows. If you're in a multi-level hospital, they may not have windows that open. You want to use surfaces that can be easily contaminated. I remember in the 1990s, a lot of departments were setting up and they were doing countertops with wood butcher block. And I kept thinking to myself, I don't understand that. I'm sure those things can breed infection. So that nobody uses that anymore because it's not easily decontaminated. You should always try to have a sink somewhere in your department and ensure proper lighting. And they say natural light is best, and it helps you to improve visual performance. You want to control distractions. I find that with the occupational therapists, the biggest distractions they have is their cell phone in their pocket or their neighboring OT that they're chit-chatting with. You also want to have temperature controls, as I said, and allow space for visitors if possible as a motivator. No one-size-fits-all gym. We know that. You're going to have to consider your mission, your caseload. I mean, if you have a pediatric department, it's going to look a lot different in terms of your space utilization as if you're in a dementia unit or you're with adults. You want to lay out for functionality and keep it spacious. You want to space out your equipment for proper transfers. You don't want a lot of that gym equipment where the OTs are going around like this and the patients, and you can't transfer on and off that equipment. You want to think about multi-use spaces. Like, could I use this space for this sometimes and this sometimes and this at other times? I love group therapy areas. I think group therapy is an amazing motivator. I know that it also helps with staffing. So sometimes when I'm planning a gym, I think about where would a group therapy be able to be handled. You think about simple floor graphics, if you can, to also help you navigate. Some of the newer gyms obviously have very nice graphics. Some of the older gyms, people are putting masking tape, and that itself, could be a risk. And if you have the money, which so few OT departments do, I love to include tech in the budget. So you have to always keep everything clean, keep your atmosphere calm, and have architectural features. Like recently, I heard about somebody developing a smart setup, like all technology. I have a niece who has a smart house, and we all say we're too dumb to go in there. Like you clap, you do something on your phone. Keep it simple, because most of the patients that we're dealing with don't have that money for the technology, as well as the ability to learn that. They say that when you're doing a gym, you should really consider colors. Like red, orange, and yellow are very vibrant colors, and they help to increase energy. So a dynamic gym where you got a lot of patients that are subacute from the hospital is great. But if you're working in a room with dementia patients, you might want it to be calmer and have like greens and blues. Pay attention to motivational signs. I always laugh when I go into a gym and they have these anatomy posters on the wall, and patients come in and they're kind of appalled by the anatomy pictures. They say that people really respond to motivational signs, like keep it up, work harder, every day is a gift. I like to see that the gyms have those because patients appreciate it. And eco-friendly lighting is always the best. When you're talking about spaces, I like to divide space into patient space, staff space, other space. So, a lot of times we don't have a lot of spaces in OT. We're not top notch on the food chain, but we could use even a small space in an organized manner to have separate space for separate reasons. And in the end, I'll show you that I have a floor plan. And even if you don't have rooms, you could think about separating space. So, in my wish list, in my fantasy world, I'd love a reception area and an OT treatment area and a gym area and an ADL suite that would have a bathroom, kitchen, and bedroom. I would love to have a splinting area, to have a group area, to have a physical agent modality area, like if there's an ultrasound machine or a TENS machine, and then a private area for those distractible patients, and an exam area if a physiatrist or orthopedic doctor is going to come and consult in the OT department. Obviously, it would be great to have a staff area nowadays. In places where there's not a lot of space, everybody shares a desk. And then other areas like storage areas and visitor areas. And then besides the area, I think space. I think I need floor space. I need a bench space for somebody to rest. I need table space, a mat space, equipment space, storage space, a reception space, staff space, and privacy space. So if you don't have the area, think about the space. And why do we do that? Because if we organize space, we have less risk. So shared spaces. So maybe the OT, PT, and speech are all in one room. And PT always seems to have bigger equipment. It always amazes me when you go into a gym and there's a parallel bar in the middle of the room. And I know that people like to have access from both sides of the parallel bars to get to patients. But the truth is, move it over to one side so that you have more functional mobility space. PT might have more physical agent modality, speech may need for quiet areas. And remember that we tend to use all space around us, not just our OT gyms, but hallways. And all of those, you need to do a physical inspection for risk. So let's now put it all together. Let's put it all together so that we understand some of the risk. We understand our mitigation or our controls, and we also understand some of our recommended space design. So we know that we're faced with bloodborne pathogens, infections, HIV, Hep B and C, flu, COVID, TB, and other Any other communicable disease like monkeypox that we're now seeing, that's a risk to us and our patients. What do we do as a method of mitigation to help eliminate or minimize in a control? We encourage vaccinations. If there are vaccinations available, not every country has all the vaccinations, but the ones that are plentiful, they should be encouraged. We always have to keep a clean and sanitary area and decontaminate. One of the things that's interesting about decontamination is some countries don't have, fancy decontamination items. Bleach, 10 parts water to 1 part bleach is probably one of the best decontaminants. If you don't have the ability to know which decontaminant to use, if you go on to Google and you look up the EPA or the Environmental Protection Agency's list of appropriate decontaminants, they actually give you ones that are the least toxic. We also want to make sure that we use PPE appropriately. So many people wear their mask under their chin. That's not appropriate. Proper hand washing. They say to sing happy birthday twice to yourself, which literally is about 26 seconds. Proper hand washing should be no less than 26 seconds. You should also, if you're ill, not come to work. And if your patients are ill, not treat them in the OT gym. You also want to make sure that when somebody new comes on with you and annually, that you explain to them the risk of infection, which infections, and what are your controls. And when you're designing a space, if you don't have a lot of space, at least have one sanitation station. Wash in, wash out. And have PPE readily available. It doesn't have to be stacks and stacks, but don't just have the mask and the gloves in the gym. Have them in the bathrooms and the washrooms. Have them in the ADL area. You need to make sure that you're not running around the entire department with dirty gloves. Any kind of disinfectant chemicals should be kept in store areas. And they say that when there is hand washing signage, that people are more apt to wash their hands. In terms of the patient spread of infection, we say a lot of our patients get sick because of the visitors who come to see them. So we ask ill visitors to stay at home. And again, we're using only good infection control techniques and procedures. And we recommend inoculations when possible, like chickenpox, monkeypox, measles, tetanus, shingles, influenza, pertussis, pneumonia, rubella, HPV, mumps, diphtheria, hepatitis, meningitis, and COVID. So if you're in a country that has these, we recommend that you encourage them. When you're designing for patients, again, you want the sanitation stations, the PPE readily available, the disinfectants, and hand washing signage. So now let's talk about regulated waste. Regulated contaminated waste are, say you're working in the whirlpool or even in the gym and you remove a person's Band-Aid with blood and body fluids. You're supposed to put it in an approved receptacle. What is that approved receptacle? So many of us don't have them. You should have a receptacle labeled for that kind of waste or a red receptacle. And you never, in terms of your space design, want it in the middle of the gym. You want it in an area where the staff can get to, where there's a higher incidence of these kind of things, but not where patients are going to reach in and touch anything. The same with contaminated laundry. A person may be on your mat or on a bed with, with sheets that are contaminated with blood and body fluid. And you really want to be able to say to them, bag it where it is and with the least amount of agitation and have a designated laundry. I'm going to move faster through it because I know we're almost at time. And this is really more for your reference. But we also know that we as staff members have a risk of musculoskeletal injuries. Obviously, we're OTs. We know about, work simplification and energy conservation techniques. We know we should reduce the unnecessary bending, twisting, prolonged sitting and standing. And really, when we're designing our stations, we should design it where we don't have to walk 1.5 miles to go get a weight. That it's nearby. And when we plan our spaces appropriately, if we have a table where we're doing mostly tabletop, we'll have our weights and those tabletop activities there in order to be able to have less stress on us as staff physically. Then we can get, unfortunately, we'll have burns from the ADL kitchen, from maybe splint modifications in our heat guns, mostly from hot packs. Obviously, we should always have conspicuous warning signs. We try always, when we're using anything with heat, to have it on the lowest settings and don't use igniting sources. And when we're designing our kitchens or our kitchen space or where we're keeping our hot packs, we should never have to reach over it to get some other piece of equipment. I know I was in one gym where they had all their splint pans and everything was literally in a cabinet on top of where they keep their splint pan. Other risks are chemicals, injuries. And again, I'm going to go through this, and this, you guys will all have this, so you could look at it at a later date. You're using the least toxic product feasible. You're going to always make sure that it is in a locked storage area. You're only going to use the chemical as the manufacturer tells you to use it. If you're using it in a chemical in a place that is not well, is not well ventilated, you have to make sure that the room is big enough so the vapors are diluted. If you're using equipment in ill repair, it could cause a shock. Decommission that piece of equipment. And also, when you're thinking about equipment in your space, make sure that the space is planned enough to accommodate for whether or not it could be increased in width or height. And all small equipment, more therapists are injured falling over small equipment left on the floor, like footrests and those kinds of things. So make sure that if you're doing a risk assessment and you're scanning your gym, make sure that you have a good storage space for your small equipment. Slip, trips, and falls, biggie for us, a big risk. Keep your floors clean, clean up your spills immediately, put warning signs for wet floors, keep your floors uncluttered, keep your exits and your passageways uncluttered, wear good footwear, make sure your patient's wearing good footwear, walk at a reasonable cadence. I actually had a therapist hurt a visitor because she was walking so fast. The visitor stopped and the therapist walked right into her. And you want to make sure that your patient's pant legs are not dragging on the floor, and you're doing wheelchair follow for those patients who might need it. Then you have to make sure when you're designing things that electrical sockets are all put where the equipment is, so you don't have these long cords right across your entire gym. And you want to make sure that hot packs and cold packs that have a tendency to drip are actually in a specific area. Same thing for the patients, just make sure their personal items are nearby and that there's enough light and no distractions and good assistive devices. In terms of your stress, practice lifestyle, healthy lifestyles, work reasonable shifts. Some of our staffed areas are quiet areas where it's a nice place to decompress. Fire, basically make sure you have fire extinguishers and make sure they're in places where you need them. If you guys have O2 tanks, don't leave them by the boiler. I'm going to skip this because that is a lot of slide, and it is a lot of specific to operational issues. And this was my attempt at a floor plan. It is not to scale because we were so happy. My assistant did most of this. I'll give her the credit. But if you could see, I tried to make all along the edges of the department our spaces or our rooms, and made sure that I had enough space between equipment and between like in the front so that there's functional mobility areas. So in conclusion, risk management is a necessary and instrumental process in assisting us with the health and safety of us as clinicians, our patients and their visitors. It is constantly ongoing. You never can rest when it comes to risk assessment. We are uniquely poised as OTs to do risk assessment because we're so used to activity analysis and breaking things into its component parts that doing a risk assessment comes easier to OTs than any other discipline that I know. And I've enjoyed spending the time together with you. Feel free at any time to reach out with your questions, reach out with concerns, or even with wonderful news that you guys created an amazing risk assessment to share with us. So thank you. And Kate, I'm going to send it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lori. This was wonderful.
Thank you.